I'm Richard RJ Eskow. The Cold War supposedly ended some 30 years ago or so, depending on how you count. So that raises the question, well, it raises, of course, many questions. One of the questions of which is how do arms dealers sell their products in the post-Cold War universe? My next guest has written a fascinating article about that for the Baffler magazine, and there are a lot of dimensions to that whole question. Lorissa Rinehart, in addition to being a writer, is also a photographer. She is also an independent curator, and she does other things as well. But I wanted to focus on the story in Baffler that was given the headline "Bombs Away." So first of all, Lorissa Rinehart, thanks for coming on the program.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have you, and the sort of subculture that exists invisibly to so much of the world, and yet so many billions of dollars flow through it, so many lives are affected and or taken as a result of it. It's a fascinating thing. So I guess what I wanted to start with, if you don't mind, is what gave you the idea to write this article?
Well, I don't remember the exact map of the rabbit hole that took me down this particular path, but it started with another article I wrote about the beginning of militarized air power with actually hot air balloons in the French Revolution. And from that, I just started researching the aesthetics of militarism. And I came across very quickly these social media posts and YouTube videos um, basically advertising conventional weapons. And by conventional weapons, I don't necessarily mean just guns, but surface to air missile systems, unmanned drones, basically everything short of nuclear weapons. So just that initial research stage and sort of following this chain gave me the idea to write this article.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the aesthetics of it. You write for Hyperallergenic and other arts magazines, and there is an interesting, I've seen some of this material before, and it always seemed to me that, to use Hannah Arendt's phrase, the banality of evil, that there's sort of always something striking to me about seeing these weapons of death, these massively effective high-tech killing machines sort of being advertised in what almost seemed like perky ways, like it's detergent or something. And I don't know if you had the same reaction, but
No, absolutely. And I really approached the article as I would an art review almost, because the aesthetics of these social media content was so striking and had so much in common with video game culture and the type of cinematography you see coming out of Hollywood. So, for instance, particularly with Lockheed Martin videos, you'll see a lot of CG animation that would be perfectly in place in a video game like Counter-Strike. In fact, it almost looks exactly the same. So I really wanted to dive into what those aesthetics were. I think to a large degree, people even question, don't even see that these tactics are being used, that these aesthetics are being used, and that this technology is being used to effectively market these, as you said, sort of very deadly weapons.
And it's interesting, what it makes me think of as you talk, Larissa, is the flow of the imagery, beginning with, let's say, in this case, video games, moving into the advertisements for these weapons, and then perhaps flowing back in some way into other aspects of popular culture, film, television, imagery of other kinds. And it makes me wonder, you talk about the fact that a lot of this material is being, for example, like you say, on Lockheed Martin's YouTube channel and elsewhere, when somebody borrows from the aesthetic of a video game, for example. I know why they do it in recruitment ads for the U.S. military, which one sees on TV from time to time. They're basically telling young people, live your life in a video game, join the U.S. Army or whatever. But in this case, these are specialized audiences of arms purchasers. So I wonder what their cultural relationship is with the imagery of video games and some of the other things we're talking about. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's a really great and complicated question. And I think as folks who grew up with video games like Halo start to become procurement officers for the military, whether that's the U.S. military, the Russian military, the Saudi military, et cetera, they do have this visual language that they understand. And so using the lexicon of video games to showcase these weapons makes sense. And then and this is pure conjecture, but I imagine as they bring them up the level to the people who actually make the decisions to buy the weapons, they're able to translate into the language that folks who don't have that language can understand. But as the initial point, entry point, it is very effective at garnering interest. I mean, I think you see that especially on the YouTube videos again, where these weapons videos have sometimes millions of views. I think it's a Lockheed Martin video for their laser guided weapon system has 8.6 million views, and that's a staggering sort of share rate for a video of this kind. But it is attractive, and people do want to watch it, and a lot of those people are in charge of purchasing such weapon systems.
It's also a fascinating statistic, and again, we're talking with writer and photographer and curator Lorissa Rinehart about her piece in The Baffler, Bombs Away. It's also a fascinating statistic because it means that millions of people have nothing to do with the defense industry. They just presumably like the imagery. And that is also fascinating. So there's an undercurrent here, it seems to me, culturally. You write, Larissa, you write about the Warrior Capability Sustainment Program, WCSP, that upgrades rather than replaces existing vehicles. Lockheed's, I'm reading your sentence now, borrowing from video games, Hollywood, and the daydreams of would-be generals, 8.6 million of them, perhaps. Lockheed's WCSP promotional video accomplishes what any good advertisement sets out to do. It establishes its product as cutting edge and cost effective, absolutely necessary and certifiably sexy. Now, I didn't see the video, but this is actually a less sexy product. I guess you're just upgrading old tanks. It's more like taking your car in to like be repainted or so. It's what I picture, but they make it sexy somehow. So, and I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard sell, right? It's like, oh, thanks for giving me a new stereo system. Like that doesn't make my crappy Geo any better. But in fact, the WCSP upgrades the weapon systems, the onboard computer systems, the monitoring systems within the tank. And the way that they make it more attractive is, forgive this sort of crassness of this, but engaging in this sort of aesthetic of echo porn that you see a lot in car ads, where the truck is going through this virginal landscape that you want to be able to participate in and drive through. And you have these slow-mo shots that sort of echo the Avengers movies when they slow everything down so you can see exactly how this destruction is being wrought on screen. So yeah, a lot of times they do pitch this affordability of these upgraded weapon systems, which you actually see a lot in ways that are surprisingly attractive despite their sort of thrifty thrifty nature. But I think another important aspect in terms of tying it back to advertising is that they do place a premium on affordability. A lot of companies highlight that their systems are affordable. And that's, again, something that you see in advertising strategies of any other product. And it also speaks directly to countries that can't necessarily afford new equipment and that have to focus on upgrading already existing equipment. And who are those nations? Who are those countries? Well, they're not the G8 countries. They are these secondary and tertiary players that become primary players, proxies within ongoing global war.
And this is where the whole question of the aesthetic seems to tie into some fundamental political questions, right? Because you have, for example, Saudi Arabia with its, and you mentioned Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia recently murdered a journalist and is horrifically oppressive in many ways to its own population, women being a special target, religious minorities, others. And yet they're also a great market for U.S. and other weapons systems. So some of this, and I'm told if you go to Riyadh or other cities in Saudi Arabia, there's satellite dishes everywhere, there's video gaming everywhere. So a country like Saudi Arabia, for example, would fit in both economically and aesthetically, and our need to appeal to them, while these ads are maybe the visual gloss on it, also has to do perhaps with, plus the oil, of course, why we're not doing something about, why instead of stopping, for example, Saudi Arabia, we're helping them attack Yemen. I don't know. I'm opening really broad there, but I don't know if you have any thoughts.
No, I find it forever interesting that we are constantly trying, or the U.S. is constantly trying to spread democracy throughout the world, and yet we're selling weapons that can effectively repress any kind of democratic movement before it even begins. And then to do so through the mechanisms of capitalism, these tried and true mechanisms of advertising that are incredibly effective, is completely antithetical to our proposed goals. Now, of course, Saudi Arabia is attacking Yemen, but also you have to consider the fact that if there ever were a truly democratic uprising within Saudi Arabia, that the government would ostensibly turn these weapons that we have sold them against their citizens.
Sure.
So, yes, again, it's not only are we selling weapons to these countries, but we're selling a way to enforce the repression that already exists.
Right, but of course, if we live in a video game, there are no real world consequences, right? So the aesthetic serves the distance. Lorissa, one last question for you, if you don't mind. You mentioned that you were expecting your first child while writing this article, so your personal YouTube suggestions populated equally by newborn care videos and promos for Predator drones to autonomous human-created units being sent out into the world. That must have felt strange.
Yes, it was. It is very strange to see how to change a diaper next to how to launch a anti-drone missile strike. But I am very well equipped to doing both now, so I'm excited about that. Just kidding.
Well, congratulations on both those fronts, and maybe we can have like a pixelated diaper, just, gradually. Well, this is a fascinating article. Again, the article is entitled Bombs Away. It's in thebaffler.com. The author is Lorissa Rinehart, writer, photographer, and curator, and much more. So, Lorissa, thanks for writing it, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.